Welcome to the Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. I am honored to have my guest. Why don't you tell people who you are, what you do, and why you do it?
I'm Dr. Andrea Torreira Gabadon. I'm a scholar, I'm a researcher, I'm an leadership coach, and I support schools and organizations to support and retain a highly effective and racially diverse workforce. Why I do it? The data points to disparities between educators of color and their white counterparts, and also points to disproportionate turnover. But beyond that, there's this idea of the dignity and the humanity of educators of color that deserve specific, equitable research as well as actionable supports. So that's the work that I endeavor to do, and that's the work that I'm blessed to accomplish.
One of the things that I hear from folks in academia is how when you are seeking to apply or to allow for the data to support a work of justice, that it is hard to get folks to support, to align. Has that been your experience as you've sought to put this labor of love out to folks?
Certainly, certainly. I've heard it said time and time again that you don't know there's a problem unless you are able to point to it, right? Or measure what is occurring. I agree with that, right? I think my book, Support and Retain Educators of Color, shows this disparity with recruitment and the retention of educators of color. But beyond that, there's this idea of like what data actually matters and counts. And I find with justice work, the story is so important, right? Because it gives depth to the numbers. But there's often this idea that stories don't matter, right? Or
Mm.
stories aren't good enough or they're not substantive. And so there certainly is need for us to understand that there's different types of data and all are equally valuable when we are engaging justice work.
What you just said reminds me of Dr. Ivory Tolson, who talks a lot about how he calls it BS numbers, right? Like, in how we're not putting the right, emphasis on where it needs to go when it comes to data and what it supports, and making those numbers matter, right? I think about it even from a K to 12 standpoint, like how much of students' lives, their families' lives are impacted because we don't link the story to the number. How much of compassion is lacking in that moment? Could you kind of speak to that for us in the sense of, like, how do we reclaim a humanity in the sense of like our numbers and why they mean and what we're doing with these data points?
I think part of being able to value the story is being able to adopt a disposition of curiosity. And
Hmm.
if we look at where the pendulum has swung in education, not just in K 12 curriculum, but even in how we train teachers and how we train leaders, we are not truly promoting curiosity and inquiry in the ways that we should. And so if we are not curious, we are not going to ask or honor the story. In fact, we're going to cultivate conditions where it's unsafe for people to share this story, right? If we are engaging in this kind of capitalist machine of manufactured urgency, right? Because the structural inequalities that our babies are facing are nothing new, right? And so they're
Hmm.
not going to
Hmm.
be addressed overnight. But if we're caught up in that machine, then we are moving too quickly to then stop and pay attention to the humanity, uh,
Mm.
to to the importance of not just the stories of our students, but the stories of the educators in our building, right? And so I think about where we are right now with the teacher shortage, the climate of continued churn of educators from our schools. And I think even in those numbers, there is a story, but we haven't taken the time at a systematic level to stop and really think about what is the story that is being told or not told that helps frame the current conditions that we're existing in.
As I was working my way through this book, I'm gonna put it up for folks to be able to see. Purchase, please buy, please buy. this work. As I was working my way through it, I was reminded of, and I actually just told the story today to my staff at my school, as my grandfather, he would like wake me up at like the most ungodly hours on Saturday to do work around the house and to teach me something. There was a deeper meaning that I didn't see at the time that I now appreciate. But one of the things that he did was he wanted to plant this garden and grow like tomatoes and vegetables and things. And so we go around the side of the house and he's like, "Yep, we're going to plant this garden." And I'm like, "Yep, just let me get the seeds. I'll throw them down. Let's go back inside." And of course, my grandfather, being patient as he was with me, was like, "No, what you have to understand is if you don't care for the soil, nothing will grow." And I think about our educators of color being planted in places where the soil of that school, the soil of that place will not sustain them. And the work that's incumbent upon leaders of all different, sides of the spectrum to be able to step in and say, how do I cultivate this soil in order to be able to sustain? I even think about my experience and, you know, so much of what I believe it was Harry Belafonte said that MLK relayed to him was that he felt like we were being assimilated into a burning house. That often feels like my experience because I often felt like I had to be palatably black. Like I had to be a certain kind of black guy in order to be passable in certain sectors. And if I had to either dial back or present a certain way, and if I didn't navigate that well, then I didn't fit, to the point where I had a school district, a friend of mine, they didn't know we were friends, that they didn't hire me because I was, quote, too black. And so I think about that. And so when we are talking to that educator of color or that leader who is seeking to build that type of environment, I always think it's mindset before it's action. So what things do we need to be challenging in our leadership in order to prepare the soil of our schools?
I love the fact that you shared that quote of the burning building, of the burning house. And when I talk to leaders, they often say, well, I don't have any educators of color, so this doesn't apply to me just yet, right? And so, closing the loop back to your comment about the burning house, I often wonder, well, are you ready for educators of color when they come?
Yeah.
Are
Yeah.
you enacting policies that are affirming? Are you rethinking or transforming maybe current procedures, right? That trying to move away from exclusionary practices to ensure that not just staff are affirmed, but students, right, are affirmed. What does your PD catalog look like, right? Whose stories are being honored and elevated in the curriculum? All of these pieces need to be in place, I would argue, even before you begin to double down on recruitment. Now, certainly, my
Hmm.
hope would be that I want every district in the United States to have educators of color. I'm in Pennsylvania. We certainly have several districts. A large part of the state does not have any educators of color. But again, the work doesn't start for the leader when the teacher is there. How
Mm,
are you thinking about these culturally affirming principles that I offer in the book and beginning to implement them now so that you are ready?
yeah. Yeah. I think, we talk about those those six principles, and I don't want to give too much of the book away for folks who haven't gotten it, but if you could kind of walk through and highlight just for us just a little sample of those six principles for folks who are listening and or maybe hearing this for the first time and need to go purchase this labor of love. What are they, and what are you challenging us to do?
Great. So the first principle is acknowledge that educator diversity matters. That looks at the landscape of education history, so not just the contemporary landscape, but looking at the origin of public schooling in the United States and the ways in which educators of color, not just in the here and now, but historically have brought value, have been advocates for justice and community uplift for all children. And for that reason, we need to acknowledge that educator diversity is a critical topic that requires all of our collective attention and strategy. Many times people contextualize educators of color matter when you have students of color, but the research actually teaches us that all students not only benefit from having teachers of color, but all students actually, when assessed, when asked, often rank educators of color higher, not because of shallow characteristics, but instead because they are taught with high levels of rigor, high levels of support and care. So that goes back to that first principle. Principle two, cultivate reflection and self awareness. I pull on the poet Lauryn Hill, who talks about you can't win if you ain't right
Right
within.
within.
Right, right. So you talked about mindset is prerequisite to action. So my argument, and I would argue is well supported by other researchers and scholars and even practitioners, right? That mindset and disposition towards equity is prerequisite to actually doing the work and ensuring that the work is
Mm.
consistent,
Mhm.
right? So if you're falling short with your equity practices in your building, I would argue, is equity something that you stop thinking about at 3 o'clock when you go home? Or is that a commitment that you're continually willing to unpack biases, continually willing to do the work that's necessary for justice? The third principle, assess and plan for action. I provide organizational tools to do an equity audit so that leaders can determine what are the practices and policies in place that either help or hurt educator retention. Principle four looks at sustainable and high impact instructional supports. And so it is critical that we are not just saying that educators of color matter, but how are we enacting professional development and other types of instructional supports that invest in their growth and create a culture of belonging in our schools. Principle five looks at fostering supportive environments for culturally responsive approaches. So we know that educators of color often bring with them a desire and a unique skill set to implement culturally responsive approaches. But we have to learn as leaders how the ways in which those practices can be compatible within our school context. They are compatible with a lot of curricula. They are compatible with a lot of school policies and practices. But what we cannot do because of our own ignorance is say that those practices that we know that are actually good for kids, because culture responsive education is good for kids and it can boost test outcomes and it can support post-secondary outcomes. But we cannot say there's no place for that here. So again, I provide guidance around how to ensure that we're meshing culturally responsive approaches with current school procedures. And then the last one is lead for an inclusive community, which essentially looks at how leaders can move beyond their own leadership dispositions to ensure that they are building an organizational culture that is affirming and that acknowledges the mattering of all peoples. And there are ways to do that, not just through equity PDs, which a lot of schools accomplish, but also through strategies such as racial affinity groups.
So one of the things that sticks out to me as you unpack the first principle is talking through the ways in which we need to interrogate, get curious about our own biases, and things like that. And one of the reasons that this sticks out to me is I think that there's a notion for some folks that would believe that because they might be an educator of color, that they might be exempt from that work. And that because I look like my students, I don't have to interrogate how my biases might affect my students. I already, judging from your work and the things that you have put out, I know we're aligned on this, but could you speak to that for us? Am I exempt because I look like my students?
Not at all. Culturally responsiveness is not an inherent trait.
Yes.
You,
Yes.
as a person of color, me as a person of color, we have work to do. Now, that work might look different, right, from our white colleagues, but there are still ways in which we participate in privilege because of various elements of our lived experience, of our backgrounds, of any one of our many identities, right? And so it's interesting as I write the book, I write it for all leaders. And part of the reason why I talk not just about white leaders, but I also talk about leaders of color and the ways in which leaders of color have at times done tremendous things that encourage and sustained educators of color, but have also reproduced forms of harm, is because I was one of those leaders, right? And so
Yeah.
I exist, or try rather, to operate from a place of humility, knowing my own missteps as a former high school administrator, knowing the ways in which I reproduced the types of toxic systems that I was in. And I thought I was exempt, right? As being triply minoritized in my building. But at the end of the day, we all, like I said, have work to do to unpack our biases. There is a phenomenal quote from Beverly Daniel Tatum where she talks about this the cultural smog of
Smog.
racism. Exactly. And so it's this idea that we're breathing in toxicity, right? Racism, and we don't even know it. So again, we all have that work to do, white folks and folks of color alike.
You talk about your high school administrator experience, and I'd love to stay there for a second. One of the things that I think folks might not get on the outside looking in, as it pertains to the work that administrators do in buildings, that we are really like middle management. Like, we help support our teachers, but then there's also upper administration that is telling us that we have to get certain things accomplished. And the reason I bring that up is because there is, I think, a sense in which there's a pressure to check boxes, to do things that some of them absolutely matter and other things don't make sense at all. But we have to do them in order to kind of keep the system running, right? Now, I bring that up because if you are a educator who is stepping in for the first time to the classroom, to whatever position that you're in education, I know that you want to charge the hill and you want to transform. And I think those are noble, good, and right and true things. But I think sometimes we don't understand the game that's being played before we walk into it. So I want you to think back to your experience as a high school administrator. You alluded to some of the missteps that you made, but I'm sure when you first stepped in, it was, we're going to change these things. And then you kind of got met with some resistance, some reality. Talk to me about that process, and now, knowing what you know now, what would you tell yourself in that position?
To put it succinctly, I would tell myself to make good trouble, right? I look at that sign behind you.
Yeah.
And part of it is, when you are new to a role, there can be timidity,
Hmm.
whether it is known, whether it's said, or whether it is unsaid. There can be a fear that is held around, can I cause trouble? Or what are the ramifications? Or what is the cost to me if I cause trouble?
Yeah.
But what I've learned, the older I get, we have to make it, we have to make good trouble. We have to speak truth to power. We can do so in love. And that's something that I'm continually learning every single
Hmm.
day.
Hmm.
But it's this idea of, if I am truly an advocate and an ally for students, for community members, and for educators, in what way am I able to utilize my voice in ways that actually brings benefit to them? Not
Hmm.
to a superintendent, not to an assistant superintendent, not to an executive director, and not to say that those roles aren't important,
Right.
but who am I honoring? Who is benefiting from this work? I particularly think about My background working in urban schools, both in traditional public and in charter, there were so many ways that in the name of student achievement, we made working conditions that were not sustainable for educators. And so
Mm,
going back to this idea of who is actually benefiting from this, I would have raised my voice more around, if you say that this is good for students, well, what about my educators? And really ensuring that my advocacy is grounded in the reality that my educators have certain insights that I do not have. And those insights are equally as valuable because they spend more time in front of our babies than I did or than I do
mm,
presently.
yeah.
Right. And so we have to pay attention to their stories. We have to ground our leadership in the themes and the trends and the patterns that we're discerning from our educators and use that again to make good trouble.
Hmm. The notion of this, I feel like there's almost a false choice consistently being placed in front of administrators, particularly. And what I mean is, am I for students or am I for teachers? I was actually asked that question when I first came in. So, the school that I serve, I was the assistant principal for the last 2 years and then stepped into the principal role this year. And let me tell you, there's a big change from the middle of middle management to the top of middle management. This is night and day. But when I was asked that question, my answer was yes. Am I for teachers or am I for students? My answer is always going to be yes, because I don't feel like that's a choice that I have to make, that I can be for the flourishing of both parties. But I think the way that our system is set up, you will have to, if not challenged, if you don't make good trouble, you're going to be forced to have to pick one over the other. Would you agree with that sentiment? And has that been you? Was that your experience as a high school principal?
Goodness gracious. I think, yeah, I would agree, right?
Yeah.
I was on a panel a couple months ago, and I remember a similar sentiment was echoed by one of the other panelists, where there was this idea of, you know, I'm a leader because I love and care for students. I'm not here for the adults in the building. And I can't help but think that that type of mentality is continues just to pervade so much of how we understand the role of the school leader. And to your point, if our educators are not well, right, our students cannot be well. And so we have to move forward in an ecosystem where we seek to reconcile, and not even reconcile, but to understand that the wellness of our educators and the thriving of our students, socially, academically, in all of the ways, right? Those need to go hand in hand with our educators' well being. If not, we're going to see continued churn, right? And that's, of course, in addition
Yeah.
to policy change. I'm all for let's pay teachers a livable wage, right? Let's create, working conditions that are sustainable and all of that. But it has to be around their day to day experiences. Because if not, there are places that will treat them better. And that's just the reality of this day and age.
Hmm.
In terms of my experience as an AP at the high school level, certainly there was this idea of we are here for the students, right? The building is on fire, student achievement is at a point of crisis, and we are positioned as the leader, as the superman or the superwoman or the super person who's coming in to save the day at
Yep.
any cost, right?
Yep.
And to some extent, I do believe in a whatever it takes approach, right? If my own child was in harm's way, I would do whatever it takes to make sure that they are well. But we cannot perpetuate harms to the adults in our building and
Mm.
say that we're doing so because it's ultimately in service of our students. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It doesn't. And part of that is, again, humanizing realistic expectations of our educators, valuing their contributions, valuing their expertise, honoring them as professionals. And I understand we also have higher numbers of folks that are coming into our work who may not have been trained as educators. But can we believe that as adults, as people of vast lived experiences, that they still have certain insights that are valuable to supporting our students?
Mm,
They
mm.
bring a certain dignity that we have to respect in our building. Yes, we can support them, right? But at the end of the day, we need to acknowledge that we need to
Mm.
hold space for all educators in a different way, particularly educators of color who are often, underrepresented, who are susceptible to racialized and gendered microaggression and other forms of harm, not just at an interpersonal level, but at a structural and institutional level.
I think that when I hear that, I think about my experience as an educator coming in, and there was a sense in which, because I could build relationships really well, and because kids who would normally act out in other places were fine with me, that I got that, but I was not starting out instructionally excellent. Like, and it wasn't even like a desire to train or to do that when I, particularly in my transition to public school. So I started out in charter. And in the charter school that I served at in in Camden, there was a sense in which, like, you are going to script out every little detail of every little lesson, and it was hard. And but what I learned was how to anticipate misconceptions, how to plan for, right? So it was really hard, but I learned a lot. But then I get to the public school, and literally night and day, I'm literally copying and pasting lesson plans. And this is just my experience. I'm not saying all, just for those who are listening, like, oh, he's bashing. No, I'm just saying my experience in the two places that I went from at the beginning of my career. Now, I say that to say that instructionally, I wasn't given the support to be excellent. And you talk a lot about that in this work, of the need to empower our educators to be instructionally excellent, and how that our teachers of color are almost unfairly left out of this equation. Talk to me about the research behind that. And because I love that you left teacher voice as part of the narrative to the data, talk to me about some of, like, who sticks out to you in that process, people that you talk to, so the stories kind of make the data come alive for us.
Yes. If it's all right with you, I actually want to start with the story.
Please.
Yes. So when I was an AP, like so many other school leaders, there's this idea of, or the reality of vacancies, right, in your
Hmm.
building, that you start the year, you don't have everyone that you need on staff. And so you're left in a lurch. And that was often something that we were having to problem solve. And as the, within my position, that was my responsibility to staff, to support, to train, to facilitate PD, all that good stuff. And so I remember one particular long-term sub that we brought in for a social studies position. Young person had done some long-term subbing previously, and we put him into a classroom. And I quickly realized, yes, you appear to have great rapport with students. Your room isn't on fire, but the babies are not learning. And so I met with him uh, week after week for, goodness gracious, for a good amount of time. We would have coaching cycles that were not tied to any form of evaluation, which I think is critical.
Hmm.
We went through the basics of how do you create a lesson? How do you use the current resources? What does classroom management look like? And I would come back to him every year that he was in the building. Let's have a small coaching cycle. And
Hmm.
there were a lot of things that I would do differently when coaching him. But at the core of it, and I say this, and this educator, I have the privilege, we live in the same city, so I bump into him every couple of months. Um, and he always says, you are the reason why I'm still a teacher, right? He calls me the OG, and I always call him out because I'm too young to be an OG.
All right.
But it's this idea of someone saw the potential and took the time to invest. And now, 10, 15 years later, he is still in the classroom and he is coaching other educators and he's the one who's leading PD. And I don't say that, or I don't share that story in a sense because I'm like, so great, right? Like, look at me, look at this case study. No, I share this story because I think about the longevity and the impact that this young man has had now 10, 15 years in education because of one person who took the time to invest in his personal growth. And not just that, but to connect him with resources, with mentors, create opportunities for him to visit other classrooms. And those are the simple ways, right, that leaders can expand their own capacity while still investing in the instructional expertise of their educators. And so, going to the data, what the data tells us is that educators of color are often overlooked when it comes to sustainable high impact supports. And when they are given supports, these supports oftentimes are not rooted in culturally responsive instruction, and there are low
Mhm.
levels of satisfaction from these forms of support. When there are supports, we also have to ask ourselves, how many times are these supports actually connected back to evaluation? And if it's connected back to evaluation, is it actually support?
Mm.
Right. And so when we think about educators of color and building a culture of sustainability and longevity and multiplying ourselves, because we have to recognize teachers are also leaders. So if we're not investing in people who have the capacity to lead, then we can't be surprised when folks feel like, well, they don't care about me. They're not investing in me. They're not engaging with the things that are of interest to me as a professional. I'm now going to look for that somewhere else.
It's one of those spaces that I'm currently, like, as I sit here reflecting on, you know, inheriting a culture and then seeking to support and cultivate and do different things that create a new normal for everybody in the building is sometimes hard. And I have educators who have told me that they presently feel a sense of overwhelm. And I try to be very reflective, right? I try to just take in what they're saying and things like that. And here's what I've been able to kind of glean. In the inheriting of this culture, there was a sense in which there was a laissez-faire type of culture. You just kind of do what you want. And there wasn't a lot of support nor accountability. Well, now that leaves our students out to dry because we're not necessarily pushing ourselves in terms of our instructional practice, nor are we pushing ourselves as it pertains to how we interact with students and what we are holding them accountable for and things like that. So now those things are in place. So if the treadmill was on zero and now we're actually at a 3.5, we're walking, it's going to feel like an all out sprint because you weren't walking for much of your educational career before me. And I say that to provide context while I'm still reflecting on what could I do to sustain, right? What are the things, right? So you think about the marathon. There's always these folks that hold out little cups of water as folks are running the marathon. How can I continue to hold out these cups for my staff as I continue to push them and coach them and hopefully sustain them for the long haul, right? And I don't really have like a finished response to that. I'm still reflecting and still trying to figure it out. One of the things that I'm seeking to do, and it's so crazy because I literally just read it in your book as I was reviewing it again, was like I'm doing check-ins. Something that is not tied to any evaluative, like let's just connect for a second. How are you? What could I be doing to better support you? And doing those across all subjects, across ways that because we're the teacher shortage is real, right? So we have vacancies. Like it's getting to the point where I might have to teach a couple classes. Like that's that's where it is, right? But I say all that because I think about what you're saying in this work with regard to teacher burnout and how there is, the professional demand that's placed on teachers is almost too big to sustain, and how those now, while might be, I'm going to use the word sufficient for everybody, right? Everybody gets this. They get
Mhm.
this high demand placed on it, but it is particularly efficient in how it affects teachers of color. If you could kind of speak to that piece as we round out our time, because I'm thinking about educators who are listening and who are like, yeah, I feel this. This is great. This sounds like some utopia, but right now we might have to find something else because this is hard, even though I love the work that I'm involved in. Could you kind of speak to that for us? And even though it might seem hard and hopeless for folks, where could they fix their attention? Where could they, what things could they remind themselves of? What are the things that are going to help us sustain for those who have a passion, even though it's hard right now?
So, as it relates to the leader, right, who
Yeah.
is navigating this desire to cultivate a staff culture of excellence, of rigor, right, but also of wellness and care for students and for staff, I would encourage them to reconceptualize how you think of support, right? So when we think of support, we often think of coaching, we think of a resource. In the book, I talk about three different ways that we can categorize support, right? So we can think of support in terms of pedagogical expertise. So are you giving resources and instructional supports that make lessons tighter, better, right? And that is critical. But it's not always the leader who is doing all things. Are you potentially overlooking ways of expanding your own capacity, looking to teacher leaders, doing things like instructional rounds, peer observations, right? Like those are small things to take some of the load off of the leader because we know at the end of the day, the work of support has to be sustainable for the leader in order for it to continue. The other two pieces that I would also offer is around just professional capacity. So we often think our educators are not doing X, they're not doing Y. Do they have time to do that? Are there ways that you can, as a leader, create efficiencies? It could be through AI, it could be through another mechanism, but doing things like contacting parents, grades, are there ways, again, that we can create efficiencies or just provide additional space for teachers to have time to do the work within the school day so they can meet expectations? That in and of itself is a form of support. And that last piece that I would provide is just around care.
Yeah.
So I affirm you, Bobby, for the work you're doing with checking in with educators. But there's so many things that we can do beyond just saying, oh, don't forget to take care of yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are we maintaining clear expectations for students? Are we upholding school vision and mission? Those things, the research tells us, are internalized by teachers as forms of care.
Hmm.
Upholding conditions for psychological safety, right? I talked earlier about, is your school a safe place for people to share their story? And so doing
Hmm.
simple things like those check-ins, believe it or not, can often make a world of a difference for an educator, that someone is willing to hold space, to listen to them. And then, of course, with that, we want to close the loop in ways that we are able to when we are provided feedback. And so, again, for leaders who are engaging a lot in this work, how can you rethink the way that you are supporting teachers through the lens of pedagogy, professional capacity, and then care? The last piece that I would offer for leader and for educator, classroom educator alike, classroom educator, social worker, paraprofessional, all of the amazing people who are doing great work with kids. Where, who are your people,
Hmm.
right? Do you have a safe place to land as you are navigating the challenges of the current educational climate? You know, we
Yeah.
are existing in, it's an election year. We
Hmm.
have local socio-political chaos, it seems at times. We have the
Hmm.
global climate with war and unspeakable atrocities elsewhere. And we know that these things for educators of color we often hold these things close to our heart for various ways, because often these local and international atrocities, there's something there, right? As
Hmm.
marginalized people, as underrepresented people, when we see folks who are like us, who the forms of harm that they're experiencing may not look like the forms of harm we're experiencing, there still is something there that we are navigating. And so I would encourage, what is that affinity group? What is that conference? What is that book? What is that group that you're just grabbing coffee with? Places that allow you to reconnect with the why, to help you reconnect to your love of justice, to help you understand the ways that you can do your work more efficiently with excellence, but also do so in service of students while not burning yourself out. Shamari Reed wrote a great book, Humans Who
To
Teach.
teach.
Yeah, and I love that concept because we have to get back in touch with our humanity, but we can't do that in isolation. It has to occur in community.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm gonna let that sit. Yeah. I think that that's a great place to round our time for folks. And I don't want to miss the opportunity for folks to connect with your brilliance, to support you, your work. So tell folks where they can get in touch with you, where they can buy this wonderful work, um, and how else they can keep in touch with all the things that you're doing and going and doing. So yeah,
Yes, so definitely I would suggest visit my website, atgabadon.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. I put content out monthly, usually try to share with folks where I'm going to be to the best of my ability. You can also follow me on Twitter, atgabadon. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn, Andrea Torreira Gabadon. But either way, I encourage folks to reach out. I long to be a critical thought partner, a friend, a safe place to land in this work. I'm a connector of people and connecting people to resources. And so, however I might be of support, please do reach out.
I want to say publicly for folks who are listening and hearing your brilliance for the first time, I have seen you interact across um, very various spaces on stages. I've seen you um, interact on podcasts with folks. And what I'm often impressed by is folks who maintain their conviction and consistency across various platforms. For me, you have continued to embody a level of care for folks. To the point where like even someone like who I deeply respect, who's like a virtual mentor of mine, like Barudi Kafele, as you were talking to him and you said, but how are you? And that simple question just led to a deeper heart level conversation in front of folks who consistently look to, you know, Principal Kafele for leadership in different ways, who are often trying to get something from him. There was a space in which he got to just breathe for a second publicly. So I want to just say thank you for that level of consistency, that level of care, and man, you are a gift, and I appreciate the work that you are doing to continuously push this type of work forward. And I hope folks pick this up, read it, and implement it because it's valuable. Absolutely.